Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Today, we're rolling out our latest policy paper entitled, "It's Time to Invest, Enhancing Current and Future U.S. Air Force Airlift." As most of you know, the U.S. Air Force provides the vast majority of the nation's airlift, both in the United States and around the globe. As we all recognize, whether in peacetime or war, everything comes down to effective, resilient logistics. Today's operational demands are exceeding the capacity of the Air Force's airlift enterprise. That's our challenge. The airmen of Air Mobility Command are doing their absolute best, but it's time to recognize that the nation needs to better resource them to accomplish this vital mission. This challenge extends past Air Mobility Command, for the Air Force has been chronically underfunded for far too long. Bottom line, the C-17 first declared initial operating capability over 3 decades ago, and we've been flying it nonstop ever since. Seeking a peace dividend truncated its production line far too early. That false hope also saw the Air Force cut the C-5 inventory in half. C-130s are still in production, yes, but additive airlift capacity remains crucial. So we need to boost new airlift investment now, including consideration of various commercial options. That's why today's report rollout couldn't come at a better time. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the author, Dr. Robert Owen. Rob is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Mitchell Institute and a professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I'd also like to introduce General Duncan McNabb, former commander of U.S. Transportation Command, a tremendous leader, a dear friend and air mobility expert, second to none. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being here today.
Good morning.
Good morning. Great to be here, Dave. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Rob, you've got the stick. Let's get started with your presentation. And while we're putting that up, as a note to the audience, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A window anytime during the discussion, and we'll get back to those at the end of the program. So over to you, Rob.
Well, thank you, Dave, and thanks to everybody watching for giving me a chance to provide a synopsis of the research and the writing we've done on this issue over the last several months. I'd like to start this particular briefing with the comment below in the box by General Hap Arnold and Ira Akers just prior to World War II. And they said that the balanced Air Force will always therefore possess a large fleet of cargo and transport planes. I like the word balance. It was really important because there are really 2 aspects to airlift futures. One is the requirement, the external part for the Air Force, what we think we're going to need to do. Of course, that's always an ill-founded guess about the future, and it changes. But there's also an internal issue, and that's balance. And to me, that means treating airlift as an integral element of our air warfighting capabilities. There is an adage that if you buy too much airlift, you undermine combat capabilities. If you buy too much airlift, you undermine combat capabilities. The airlift force structure needs to be an integral part, a proportional part of the Air Force. And I'll be addressing both of those perspectives as we go along. Slide, please. So here's my point. The current U.S. airlift system lacks the capacity and does not have the right mix of mobility aircraft to deliver and sustain joint warfare forces in a future conflict against a peer competitor in a contested environment. In other words, we have some big wars out there that we're worried about, and we're not ready for them in the airlift world, not at least to the degree we should be. The airlift inventory is simply not sized or balanced for the kinds of large-scale wars the United States anticipates. Next slide, please. That seems kind of an incredible statement. We do have a really large airlift fleet, and it appears large, but in reality, only a fraction of it is focused on combatant commander demand. The USAF operates 550 large transports. The Civil Reserve Fleet, its auxiliary, operates some 450 mostly large airliners, and these compose the common user fleet that's available to all COCOMs, or combatant commands. The Navy, Marines, and Army also operate their own airlift forces, what we generally call service organic fleets, and these fleets are focused on the needs of the owning services. They're not generally assigned to combatant commands except as assets of the surface combatant forces to which they are assigned. Next slide, please. Even as our fleet is large, it is shrinking and it continues to shrink. I picked these two dates, 1989 and 2025, to illustrate what happened after the end of the Cold War and the impact of the so-called peace dividend on the fleet. If you look at 1989 and you run the numbers, you come up with about 1,039 large transport aircraft assigned to the Air Force. An average age of about 20 years old. In other words, these are kind of middle-aged airplanes. They're still in good shape and the reliability is pretty good. In 2025, the poor old C-5 fleet is 37 years old on average, meaning some airplanes are over 40 years. We're down to 52 of them. The 141 is gone, but it's been replaced by C-17s. But as General Deptula pointed out, they've been ridden hard and put away wet for about 20 plus years, and they're actually older than they look. The 130 fleet is only half the size of what it was in 1989. It does have new airplanes, but they're only marginally more capable than the ones we had in 1989. So today we have 551 aircraft. They're 23 years old. And here's the important thing. They're going to continue to get old without a replacement or modernization. If you look at 1989 again, the asterisks indicate every program we had for every one of these still healthy aircraft had modernization or outright replacement programs. There's no such plan today. There's a statement from the Air Force, in fact, recently, that the fleet's going to get really old. The C-5s are going to be serving until, now the numbers are running away from me, but the C-5s are going to be in their 50s and the C-17s in their 60s by the time they retire. These are old airplanes, and like your old cars, this is a big deal because their maintainability, the cost of maintaining them, their reliability, are all going to go down irreversibly. They're just simply going to be more and more expensive to keep at a lower reliability rate. This is a dangerous trend. And airmen, again, as General Deptula pointed out, are doing a lot more right now with about half of the airlifters they had before to do a smaller job. Next slide, please. There are a lot of things that are increasing demands progressively even now and certainly in the future. We've reduced the number of forward deployed forces out there on the front lines, if you will, and they're facing the possibility more than ever before of concurrent strategic threats breaking out, big threats. The Pacific distances involved in our strategy shift reduce throughputs compared to other theaters. In the good old days, when we only worried about the Russians, it would take a day for a C-141 to make a round trip to Europe and back. It takes around 4 days, predictably, for a C-17 to get out to the Westpac, deliver its load, and come back. So what does that mean? Well, if we have 100 transports trying to support a NATO contingency, we can figure initially of being able to fly 100 sorties a day into Europe with that throughput. If we're looking at doing the same thing in the Pacific, we're only going to get 25 sorties a day as a throughput, the others being en route. So the distances truly do dilute our capability. Logistics, we know, will be under attack. I've done several risk assessments, and it's clear that in future wars, our airplanes and our air crews are going to be vulnerable to attack from their front porches and on the flight line all the way to the forward combat zones. The services have continued their tendency to want more and more air mobility support in order to be able to fight in modern war. Agile combat employment in the Air Force, our presumption of logistics under attack. The Army is focused on continuous maneuver for all units all the time. And they've invented their multi-domain task forces to provide long-range surveillance and fires out in the well beyond the forward edge of contact between forces. The Marine Corps look at a plan to deploy whole squadrons of F-35Bs to forward armoring refueling points and stay in those areas for weeks on end. And they also have invented their littoral combat regiments, which are small versions of the MDTFs of the Army. Even the Navy, which was never really a large user of airlift, with its distributed maritime operations and its plan to reduce port visits and depend on ports, are going to use a lot more airlift than they did in the past. Slide, please. At a micro level, it's worth taking a look at just how heavy forces are. Moving a fighter wing to a base would take a few dozen C-17s if it was an established base. But it will take hundreds of C-17 flights to move a fighter wing into expeditionary environments without the normal base logistics and facilities available. An Army Patriot battalion with just 2 fire units takes C-17 sorties. You're looking at a Patriot a battery right there. That takes 7 C-17 sorties, but moving the whole battalion and its necessary support can take up to 128 sorties. Task Force Hawk in 1999 is an extreme example of the weight of Army forces. It took 500 C-17 sorties to position 2 battalions of Apache helicopters, 48 aircraft into Albania, and ultimately the movement of 22,000 tons of material and 5,300 troops to get the whole kit and caboodle set up. From an airlift perspective, we always say the Army does not have light units. It only has heavy and incredibly heavy ones. Next slide, please. Persistent shortfalls are a problem. One, as the point I'm making, obviously, is that there's not enough airlift. But the airlift system is not optimized for efficient homeland to forward destination maneuver. The C-130s don't receive cargoes well from the big airplanes, or efficiently from the C-5s and C-17s. None of the aircraft have true short takeoff and landing capabilities or really soft field capabilities. And they all depend on fixed and expansive support infrastructures to base their operations. The impact, reduced throughputs, reduced ability to move essential equipment forward, delayed force closures will impede the development of joint operations, higher fleet lifecycle costs, and increased vulnerability to attack. Next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but basically I'm arguing that the airlift community is not scaled or equipped for agile combat employment. The Air Force is focused a lot on ACE for combat units, but it's not put a lot of time into working on the ability of airlift forces to survive in forward areas, do their job. They spend too much time at predictable bases, predictable parking spots, and on predictable air routes. All that equates to vulnerability. The airlift units need to figure out how to employ airlift with agility to survive. 2 concepts I've put forward. One is dynamic basing, where we use multiple bases and shift among them daily. And the other one is dynamic dispersal, which involves shifting parking spots literally hourly on forward operating bases, such as this diagram down here illustrates. And the point is, if you're shifting hourly, that's pretty well within the targeting cycle for long-range weapons, and enemies shooting at those airplanes will never know exactly where they are. Next slide, please. We have few airlift aircraft, almost essentially science projects, that have robust suites of secure communications and data links to provide crews with comprehensive situational awareness and protected access to command centers. What that means is that our crews are flying blind in combat theaters. They don't know what the situation is around them. They don't know where threats are. They don't know where opportunities. And the only way they can find out is if the air operations centers have the time to tell them on what are essentially unguarded frequencies or unprotected frequencies. So once again, more vulnerability and reduced efficiency of operations. Next slide, please. So what are the recommendations of the study? Well, first, near-term enhancements that are all relatively moderate cost. We need to put advanced command control communication systems in every airlift aircraft. There should never be a situation when aircrew has to go on to unsecure frequencies to find out what the heck is going on. We need to refill sustainment stocks to increase readiness and capacity. This is really a cost-effective way and a critical way to get more from the fleet and make it more reliable. If we can buy the parts to get a 5% increase in availability, that's equivalent to getting 10 more C-17s in the fleet, which would cost $3 to $4 billion to do otherwise. Take a hard look at the Civil Reserve Air Fleet and other private-public partnerships. The craft has been with us a long time, but it's important to understand that in the 1960s when it started, it involved about 15% of the airline fleet. Today it involves about 7%. I see an opportunity for growth, and I think it's one that needs to be examined a little more closely. And then the long-term solutions is to purchase aircraft that are designed to service the two core missions of air mobility or airlift, which is basically the strategic long-range inter-theater lift and the intra-theater lift. The requirements, the performance requirements are listed, and I won't go through them in detail because of time, the press of time. By one point I would like to kind of close with, though, that is we are very late to the game on this. This time to start was a few decades ago, and the Air Force did make a couple of false starts, but nothing came of them, so we need to really get serious and consistent and start pushing hard now. Next slide. Just some reading some of you may be interested in to kind of get an idea of some of these issues that I'm raising here. And then next slide, please. And that's it. General Deptula, I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for the presentation. Let's jump into some detailed questions now before we open it up to the audience. Now, Joe McNabb, you've been watching these trends for years. What are your thoughts on the challenges that Rob outlined when it comes particularly to demand outstripping supply?
No, again, Dave, great to be here. And I compliment Dr. Owen, who I've learned from for a lot of years. So Dr. Owen, that was a great presentation. And I really think you captured just how far we're missing the fact that when we think about what the requirement is today and our capacity to meet it has really changed. And I think I've always said that one of our greatest asymmetric advantages that we have in our military is our strategic lift, our ability to move, our strategic ability to move. And everybody depends on it. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but I would just say that when you think about all the ground forces, you think about the Navy, you think about the Air Force is the smallest user of that. And folks don't realize that. And so this is one of those joint enablers that everybody depends on, much like space, much like our nuclear triad. It is one that is that joint enabler that everybody depends on. And so what has changed, I think, dramatically is the threat. When you think about China as a rising power and openly competing with us on the military front, and then what they bring to that fight that really changes how we used to do airlift, which was back in the days of Vietnam, we would do much like we would bring them into a major port and then C-130s would take it forward. And then we began to say, hey, why can't we do direct delivery using C-17s right into the final destination? And now because of the threat, that no longer may be the best way to do that. And as China comes up with weapons that threaten us, it becomes one that really changes that whole dynamic on how we do this. As I think Rob really outlined very well, the reductions in our strategic and tactical airlift I chaired a defense science board a couple of years ago on survivable logistics, specifically looking at Indo-Pacific area and saying, how would we do this? And I would say that what came up is based on the changes of the concept of operations of our different forces on how they would do it. Again, as Rob mentioned, each of them are talking about dispersed operations that actually require more airlift, not less, and more theater airlift than less. And when you look at that number of C-130s being reduced from 697 to 277, you can say that, well, they did that because we were starting to do direct delivery, and yet now we have a whole different ballgame. Additionally, driving this is the reduction, in our system, but also the under-resourcing of spares and reducing crew ratio during peacetime, saying, oh, well, we probably don't need all that. And some of it followed because, well, we didn't have the spares, so we didn't have the availability, so we didn't need the crew ratio. And what we have to do is we have to increase both the spares, get to that 100% so you get availability, and in fact, do the same thing with the crew ratio to say, what is the crew ratio we need to maximize the use of these airplanes? And so I think those are huge in this. And then the new concepts. And this has to do with what we can use, especially commercially viable, like the craft. And you think about long-range drones that could deliver to these tactical small bases. You think about other even larger airplanes. Like I think that we absolutely need to recapitalize the 130 fleet, but I also think the same with the C-17. And as we think about a replacement, it needs to be about that size and that kind of capability, but maybe able to go farther and with more capabilities. But when you talk about that last 100 miles of going in under attack, think about what autonomous drones could do. You could also say airships. You could also say unmanned autonomous barges. I mean, it doesn't have to be air, but you need to reduce that overall capacity so you can use your C-17s and 130s where they're most needed. So those new concepts really demand a whole different mindset, and we have to change with that, given that China threat. So that's what I think that kind of outlines what I think, why the threat is, or why the capacity requirement balance is off, and we have to be able to get on with it.
Well, you made a really good point, given that while the Air Force airlifters certainly support our own service, the reality is that most of their sorties support the other services and beyond, including other agencies and allies. And you did talk a bit about it, but could you expand a bit to help our audience understand the full scope of what's in play with this demand signal and just why it's so important?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we were always able to do was you can match the type of asset to whatever the requirement is. And in many cases, we were going into benign environments, which allowed us, really ability to use the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. I mean, right now on the craft, we use about, right now we plan on them taking 40% of our cargo into the theater and 90% of the personnel. And you think about how much that is and how much the craft can do. But now you think about, now it's going into a threat zone. You may not be able to use the craft because they don't have the defensive capabilities. So that puts a huge push on that. And as you mentioned, my example was when I was at AMC and at Transcom. Every time we started to do something when something would happen in the Middle East or in South Korea or in Korea, we would end up starting with, okay, hey, we got to move forces in, and we would get the tip fit, everything would go, and about the day before we would begin to move the forces that everybody said, they'd say, hey, we have to have a Patriot battery. We got to protect our people. We go, and every time the Patriot battery would have to be moved, and we had to make everything else wait because it took the majority of our airlift to be able to do that rapidly. So we have that kind of throughout. And you think about around the world, there's other things that may happen. And the fact that you're going to turn to your mobility forces and say, hey, we have to go take care of this now. And you think about a China threat and a Russia or someone taking advantage of that somewhere else, and you think about how fast you can swing forces And so that kind of really gives you a feel. When you think about the Navy fleet, the first thing they do is they send their missiles in, and then they need to be referred. We have to take new missiles in, and it happens on every occasion. I do think that when we go to war, we bring up everybody, every reserve, every guard, every active duty. We bring all of that together, and we then so we have to rapidly mobilize that. But the part that's really key is that how do we mix and match that against the threat we have? And we need new capability to do that.
Well, Rob, related to this point that Joe McNabb just made, some of these joint airlift requirements are quite resource intensive. Now, you ran through some stats regarding lift occasions that we've had to deal with in the past. Could you just review the size of those just for our audience's edification?
Sure. I'd start by reiterating General McNabb's point is they're too big. The forces are massive, and one of the issues is everybody wants to go first when it comes along. The Army wants to get there and defend the area, and the Air Force wants to get there and defend the airspace, and now more and more the Navy wants to get there, and even Space Command needs lift to put its support units and communications units into the theater. It just goes on and on. How heavy? Well, we looked at Task Force Hawk, which was supposed to be positioning two battalions, each one with 24 Apache helicopters in Albania. But by the time the planning was done and all the support, the medical, the weather, the tower, engineers, the supply, and so on, were added on to create a complete unit that could defend itself if attacked and also to conduct limited offensive operations. It weighed 22,000 tons. Well, the field was limited, and we could only get 20 C-17s a day into that airfield, and it took 6 weeks to move those forces in. Now imagine if we were trying to move a similar force to the West Pacific, where we could only generate around 25 sorties a day. We'd have the same problem. Trying to get a joint force into an area, say the Philippines, could take 6 weeks. Well, what's the other side doing? The other side has its own mobility problem. We always have to remember enemies aren't 10 feet tall. So it's not a call for panic, but it's a call for an awareness that the role when we're deploying forces is to maintain maneuver and firepower dominance the whole time. So we need to be flowing forces in faster than they can. The airlift element right now, the best airplane for that for efficiency is a C-5, and that's the most abused part of the fleet. But that's a problem. Its radius of action, if it's going into a airfield without refueling capability, in other words, it's got to do a radius of action of its own, fully loaded is only 600 miles. There are a lot of islands that are more than 600 miles apart in the Pacific. So the fleet is simply, I would argue, if you look at the scale of things, the fleet just isn't ready. Not the way we hope it will be.
Yeah, speaking about the Pacific, Rob, can you walk us through some of the specific challenges that mobility airmen are going to be facing operating in the Indo-Pacific compared to the operating environment that we've faced over the past 2 decades?
Well, again, as the general pointed out, the last 2 decades, we were operating from an air mobility perspective, largely benign environment. Even in Afghanistan, an occasional mortar attack was about all we ever worried about, and the airlift flow was stretched out for efficiency of arrival and cargo and use of cargo handling facilities and so forth. In the Pacific, I always tell people the lessons we need to learn about air warfare in the Pacific are going to be learned from the 8th Air Force, not Afghanistan, not CENTAF, because the nature of the enemy is such that we're going to be fighting in surges. And then there'll be periods of calm behind where in between. Well, airlift is going to be like that. We're going to have to generate formations of airlift aircraft across, and they are going to have to be protected all the way. The threats can range from a hired thug shooting a pilot on his front porch to submarines with air defense missiles between California and Hawaii to D-21 rockets being fired at 1,000 miles by China, to fifth columnists. A country like Philippines has 30 million ethnic Chinese and 1.5 million Chinese expatriates. You can't believe that there isn't some connection to the Chinese military. We're not going to be safe on our bases, and they're going to know where we are. That 1.5 million Chinese all have cell phones and sat phones. So we're going to have to come up with concepts that allow us to, if you will, as Cassius Clay said, our Air Force is going to have to sting like a bee, but we're also going to have to float like butterflies. We're going to have to know how to move. And that's not just the fighters, it's the air mobility forces as well.
Well, I like your analogy, but I'm curious as to how many people in the audience know who Cassius Clay was. But be that as it may,
I'll make you sad. The last class I had, it came up that I asked him, "Oh, how many of you out of 35 students, how many of you know who John Wayne was?" 2.
well, that's
Our relevance is a ephemeral thing.
well, you got to stay up to speed. Okay, look, just to elaborate, could you? We look at the same number of airlifters in Europe or the Middle East versus the Pacific. Those two comparisons yield vastly different outputs. And as both of you have mentioned, any potential conflict with China is going to require airlift capacity that crosses the Pacific. So how's that going to dilute availability of mobility effects?
General McNabb, would you like?
Oh, I think, no, I thought that was for you. I'm sorry.
Well,
Either one of you
I think
guys.
you have
I
a
mean,
lot
I
more
don't.
credibility.
Whatever.
No, I think the part, I mean, it's dramatically different, and it's mostly because of the threat that you face. And you'll face a similar threat in Russia with their precision strike, just like China has that, just like we have. And now you've got to completely change how you think about you're gonna do this. But I would say the distances, as Rob mentioned earlier, the distances in the Pacific it makes it completely different than what you would do in Europe. Plus, you'd have our NATO allies there. You have lots of other capacity, and out in the Pacific, you just don't have that same kind of structure. You still have great alliances, but it's still not near the size that the European NATO partners can provide. So from my standpoint, the Pacific becomes infinitely harder to be able to do this, and which means you need more capacity, different types. Again, those interconnectors that will allow you to transfer from the larger airplanes or from sea lift and then get them to the different bases is going to be really a profound change. And I really compliment AMC and doing exercises that really tested that in the Pacific a year ago. And I would say it's tremendous. It just showed all the shortfalls that we'd have to do and how we might do that. But again, we've got to think about using technology to help us with that problem. And we also need to think it's not just going to be air. You can also do a lot by prepositioning stocks, by improving our sea lift world, better types of ships that can get into those ports to make that efficient. And like I said, things like autonomous barges, things that will allow us to take kind of the non-lethal stuff like matting and food and water and things like that we could take by ships. And if you lost that autonomous barge, it wouldn't be the end of the world. You just replace it. And then that leaves you with the higher end stuff that's much more expensive and more critical. You can leave that to the airlift. So I think those are the kinds of things we have to be thinking through and setting the theater, the Pacific theater. And again, I'm thinking preposition. You could really make a big difference if you could get that right.
The only thing I would add to that, in Europe, we had 15 relatively economically well-off allies, and they had consequently pretty stout infrastructures of modern airfields and even highway strips. Germany had something like 79 highway strips that could handle C-130s. I landed on one of them. It was just like a regular runway. That was a big difference. The Pacific, other than around the South China Sea, other than parts of the Philippines, Luzon and the area around the Ormoc Sea, they don't really have that kind of airfield density. And so your ability to use, for example, agile combat employment to move large amounts of air delivered cargoes into those areas are limited. And when you get to the south around Peleliu, and those areas, you've got one airplane or one airfield for an entire island complex. And you can build that airfield, but now it just becomes a fixed target. It's like hardening airplanes. That concept became obsolete in 1973 during the Arab-Israeli War, and certainly in the Gulf War. If a hardened shelter simply marks the target. And so it's going to be unpredictability that's going to make the difference. And that takes airfield infrastructure and also in advances in logistics, pre-positioning, and so forth.
Okay, Joe McNabb, here's one for you. Post-Cold War pressures to maximize efficiencies saw various elements of combat resilience cut. Sustaining logistics under attack is going to drive the need for greater attrition in reserve force structure, force protection measures, and so on. So could you speak a bit about where you think we need to regrow areas of resilience in today's airlift enterprise?
No, you bet. And, we've talked about, get the maximum out of every airplane by the spare parts and the proper crew ratios that make that all happen. But it's also the training. It's going to be, we're going to have to end up having, like we were able to use C-17s in places we couldn't use other airplanes because they had the defensive systems and the tactics to go into small airfields and kind of, do a spiral down descent to keep them out of the high risk areas. I would say that we're going to have to spend a lot more time on that. And you think about the rest of our fleet, it doesn't have defensive systems in many cases. And you think about the craft, this is when you have to start thinking about giving them some capabilities so that we can operate them farther forward. I would also, I mentioned again about the kinds of airplanes as we replace the C-17, it should have better capabilities, longer range, and it can be about the same size, but as you said, be able to go into those smaller airfields even better than we do now. I think with the 130s, I think Rob makes a great point. With modern technology, we could make them so that they could carry more farther and more efficiently. And so something, as you think about how many times we've modified the C-130, the J model is a vast improvement over the former 130H and all the other ones. But I would say technology has allowed it to be even better. And so I think that we should be really working hard on that. And then I think that there's the other concepts. They've got concepts of very large airplanes that carry, 3 or 4 times as much as a C-5. And you think about that again, if you think about, hey, I'm going to take it into a airfield that is, out of range of precision strike from China, and then we're going to take it forward from there, you can see that you can get some of those. It could be even an airship. But I would just say that getting airplanes that can allow you to take in large amounts and then change the way our ConOps works to take care of the agile, the ACE concept. Again, I think the other one that always hits me is that the training is going to be very important to make sure our crews, and however you're going to use them, you've got to make sure they have the defensive systems and comm. And Rob brought that up, is the comm, making sure that they have the picture and can be managed very quickly and be able to move with the threat. And you think in many cases, they may have to be just like the old days with the when we were moving ships across to resupply Europe during World War II. You may be having escort fighters be with them on certain occasions where the risk demands that. So there's a lot of things that we have to think through, that if we're really going to do this, and I think folks are talking a lot about it. I'll tell you, the president's new priority of making survivable logistics one of the things that he wants focused on is a huge thing that we can take care of, and again, work with industry, because they really are offering some pretty good capabilities. Again, I'll mention that we also need to think about the joint capability, and as Transcom, there's a lot of things you can do on the other portions of the mobility. You got airlift, you got sea lift and surface, and then you have pre-positioning. You need to really figure out how to best use all those. And I would say you can pre-position that stuff. That makes that you've reduced the distance issue by a lot, and we have reliable partners out there. Again, with the idea that one of the problems you have if you have a large base where you have a lot of spares, it becomes a target. So all of that's got to be worked through, and so it's not an easy one. It's one that we really got to get after.
Now, Rob, one of the major findings of your report focus on the need to ensure the current mobility force is better connected from a command and control perspective. Could you elaborate more on how that would better empower AMC crews?
Well, first, let me give you an example from the 1970s when I was young and handsome, and I had orders from Ramstein to fly to Bardufoss, Norway, as part of an exercise and drop off a load. And when I got to Bardufoss, there was nobody there. And one Norwegian lieutenant walked out and he said, "Why are you here?" And I explained it. He said, "Well, they all went to Bodo." And so there was not a problem. I mean, we called on the landline, we called Ramstein and said, "Well, they're at Bodo." And they said, "We'll go over there." Now we flew over to Bodo and delivered. If you don't have comms, and Ramstein had tried to notify us as we were approaching the area, but they couldn't get a hold of us. And they tried to get a hold of us through the airline system, which is completely unclassified. Not important in peacetime, but you can't have that in wartime. And so the first advantage of the comms is it allows the command and control system, the commanders, to have control of their forces all the time, not just episodically when they check in on high frequency radio or if they have a SATCOM. And they can do it in a classified fashion. For the air crew, having access to a robust data linkage and comm, it means they know what's going on. They know where evolving threats are appearing, how they're being dealt with. Seeing that there are two Chinese fighters 120 miles away is one thing. Knowing that there were 4 F-22s between them and you is another thing. Well, you can't pass all that by voice. You need a data system like the existing Link 16 system so that you've got a picture. And the crew is empowered and trained, as General McNabb pointed, to make an appropriate decision. Do I turn and run? Do I go to a lower altitude? Do I just motor on because the F-22s can do anything? You can't control your system by voice and intervention from on high effectively in combat. You have to have a decentralized concept where the crews make intelligent decisions, maybe supported by AI or something else. That's why it's important. We simply aren't going to be able to fight effectively or conduct mobility operations in a major modern future war if the airplanes are all out there acting as independent agents in complete ignorance.
Yeah, let me grab you for a second here before we move to the audience questions with a follow-up. What about when, just like you said, connectivity is disrupted? Don't we need to begin training with delegated decision-making and mission command as part of the objective, which is 180 degrees opposite the way we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan? But it sure seems to me like we need to incorporate that kind of decentralized set of operations more into our training. What say you?
Well, if I believed in reincarnation, which I don't, I was one time a frigate commander in the Royal Navy about 1805. And one of the things I liked about that, they were an entity in themselves. And they got mission type orders from the Admiralty. And if you've ever read them, it just said, go take care of national interests in the Indian Ocean for 2 years and come home. And that frigate captain was expected to have the basic knowledge to make decisions without knowing what was going on in the rest of the world, but they dealt with their environment. But they had to kind of think, well, Britain may be, one example, Britain may be in peace talks when I left. Well, are we at peace or not at peace with that French warship or freighter? Well, I got my orders, and he doesn't look like somebody I like, so he takes an action. And in fact, Whitehall expected him, or the Admiralty expected him, to make a good decision. And when the court-martial happened, they would kind of look at, well, what could you know reasonably about that circumstance? So mission-type orders and smart crewmen will be how you deal with comm out.
Yeah, well, look, thank you both for that great discussion. What we're going to do now is open the session to questions from the audience. I think all of you know the drill by now. I'll call on you. If you raise your hand, please state who you are and then ask your question. But while we're waiting for folks to raise their hands, if you elect to do so, we've got a lot of questions on chat. So let me start with the first one from Glenn Culler. Glenn asks, the U.S. Air Force stretched the C-141 by about 23 feet. Is it possible to also stretch the C-17 for more capacity? Joe McNabb?
Yeah, I think that them coming back and looking at the C-17 and what they could do, I would say that one of the things the C-17 is also built for is those short takeoff and landing areas. And even in the 141, we had to worry about the tail drag when we landed with the stretch. So my take is that that would be a concept. It's probably would be easier to come up with a new airplane that did the things you needed rather than try to redesign the C-17 to that level. It wouldn't be bad to kind of take a look to see if it would, if they could do that. But right now, obviously, they destroyed the tooling for the C-17. So whatever they're going to do, what I would do with this, looking at the C-17 is what are the things that we could do that would enhance its capabilities, and that might be one of those.
Okay, here's another one. Go ahead, Rob.
Just a quick technical issue. The C-17 was a stretched C-130 in cross-structure, cross-section, and so forth with swept wings. It was round all the way through, and it was actually an easy task to stretch the 130. C-17 is not round all the way through. It's not symmetrical. And so what I was told by a Boeing engineer was they've looked at it, and it just doesn't work well.
All right, here's another one from Glenn, and I'll elaborate a bit. What are your thoughts regarding using transports to release palletized weapons as de facto bombers? Obviously, this puts more pressure on an already too small force. Thoughts on that?
I think anything you do to make the enemy not sure what capabilities you have is a good thing. And even if we said we were doing it and didn't do it, the fact that we could do it would make them have to adjust to that. And I kind of think that taking a look at ways that we could do that relatively efficiently, with the standoff types of weapons, again, it's not a bad thing for them to be having to worry about from their end. And so I'm good that we keep looking at that. And I just think about how Star Wars really made the Russians go, my God, we cannot compete with them. There's no way, and they're going to take away our capacity to hold them at risk. And so basically that brought them to the peace table. So whether or not it would ever work, especially back in those days, didn't really matter. The fact that they could do it or were thinking about doing it made them go, my God, how could we deal with that?
Rob?
Well, it's technically feasible. We've launched an ICBM from a C-141. In the Pentagon once, I dealt with a proposal to drop mortar rounds by the thousands guided mortar rounds by the thousands out of C-130s in Afghanistan. It actually was a pretty good idea. It was not pursued. But I agree completely with it. General McNabb, anything you can make them lie awake at night worrying is a good thing. And having even just a handful of those airplanes available, it would make the bad guys nervous. And the fact is, the transports, I love the B-21, and it's absolutely necessary airplane, but it's going to be tanker intensive and relatively short radius of action once it leaves the tanker. An airplane like a C-17 has a much longer radius of action, so it does offer you some opportunities you might not have.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one from Gerald White. What about manning? As I understand it, today's crew manning per aircraft is just about half of what it was during Desert Storm. We were running out of crews some days before running out of available airplanes. Comments?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, they've got to put the crew ratio back up to what our max utilization during wartime would be. And for the C-17, it was a 5.0, so we reduced that. And you end up going, and that again had to do with spare parts and others. So I think it's nuts to have a capital asset that isn't supported properly by its spares, its maintenance, and its crews. The capital expenditure is huge, and there's no airline in the world that would do that would not take care of the spares and the crews to make sure they take max advantage of the capital investment. I had a thing. Herb Keller, and was a good friend of mine, and we sat in when and we were going through the availability on the different airplanes, and he looked at it and he said, and the C5 was 50%, the C-17 was maybe 80, and he goes, you know what the availability on our Southwest fleet is? 98%. And it would show you that we need to think about it that way. Is once you've done that you buy the airplane, you've got to make sure that you sustain it properly and you crew it properly. And in wartime, we're going to need every bit we have and more. And so I would say that I couldn't agree more, is that they've got to get back to what your wartime crew ratios need to be. And it can be a mix for us with both active duty and reserve. And we've done that very well, I think probably better than anybody, on how we use the total force. And a lot of that capacity is in the Guard and Reserve. But again, we need more crews, which means more training, it's more dollars. All of that stuff needs to come in. But it is crazy to have these airplanes and not be able to maximize their value.
Great point.
There is an alternative. There is an alternative, which would be an artificially intelligent R2-D2 embedded in the aircraft systems and a single pilot. The airlines loved that idea. The aviation insurance industry, which I briefed on it at one time, puked all over it. They didn't like it. And they finally said, well, we think that's a great idea. Put it there right between the pilots, but we're not insuring single pilot airplanes. And but that's an option with a military transport, particularly one just carrying cargo. You would have just one pilot.
Now, and at some point, it just makes good sense, but then you have to get to the reliability rates, the AI, and so on and so forth. But it does point to an option today and in the future that we haven't had in the past.
Let me, Dave,
go
I'd like
ahead.
to say one other thing. This is where you get into the autonomous. I really think, when you think, if you can get a long-range drone that can carry a decent amount, and it's autonomous, it changes the whole game for getting that last part in, making sure that it's efficient. You could have, every base could have 3 or 4 of them, and whatever you have, and it's cheap and it doesn't cost you any crew ratio. And that would allow you to then focus your crews on the things that they do best, and when they need to carry the most and the most important mission. So I think that's one that hits me. That's just a natural. And again, it could be drones, it could be autonomous barge, it could be airship, it could be lots of things. But if you make it autonomous, it changes where you can use it. And really, when we did Afghanistan, we took everything expensive in by airlift, and everything else we did, we tried to take it in by surface. And it worked well. And when the surface got behind, we could airlift to get it caught back up. But that's how we did it.
Got a question for you from Joshua Corzilis. Do you have an estimate for the number of airlift aircraft the Air Force should aim for? What's the split between short-range and long-range airlift? If we were buying today any particular type of aircraft that the Air Force should look to buy, what would it be?
I've done several papers that alluded to that, stepped up to it. The big problem is that you can't begin to answer the question until you forecast the circumstances and so on. And the more precise those are, the more precisely wrong they'll be in the future. We just don't know what the future is going to bring. And that's where the internal balance issue or perspective becomes, I think, more important for creating stable policy. What's right for the Air Force? Where's the Air Force going, and how much airlift should be part of that equation? The ratio between long-range aircraft and short-range aircraft depends on the aircraft to begin with and the circumstances. But we've actually, over the years, kind of come to a general conclusion it's even Steven. Even though the short-range theater airlifters don't carry as much, they don't carry it as far. And the two fleets have been largely equivalent. Maybe some variation. We used to have 700 C-17s and only, I think, 400 or so heavy transports. but that's probably about as close as you can get. What do you need to move the cargoes on, and what are the capabilities? I would just say that I'm not a fan of the Panacea airplane, which is what Panacea airplanes don't work out, whether F-111s or even the C-17, which is a mediocre long-range airplane and a mediocre theater airlifter. It had a specific mission when it was designed, which was to reinforce Europe, and it was perfect for that. But it becomes problematic or less efficient in other areas. I'm a believer that the two basic missions, and I've got a slide that I didn't spend a lot of time on in the briefing, look at it, they're fundamentally different in their operational requirements. And one is maximum throughput, very large airplane operating off of developed fields, somewhere back in the rear beyond what General McNabb said was enemy long-range fires. But there are a lot of other threats you got to worry about. And then one that was designed to handle the same kinds of cargo as the big airplane, but not as much, and with a reasonable theater range, define that, and the ability to have very aggressive airfield requirements. And one of the readings I have is a study I did for the Air Force Research Institute, what the next theater airlifter should look like. My conclusion, after looking at about 70 different programs in the past, was a turboprop type aircraft or prop fan with a tilting wing, but not a vertical. VTOL is a waste of money. In the theater airlift realm, it's aerodynamically not useful, but you can get some really good, very aggressive, super short takeoff and landing with a moderate tilt. Those that don't believe me, take a look at the XC-142 videos from the 1970s. Get an idea what it does.
Okay, I think we have time to squeeze in one more from someone that you're both familiar with, Ken Merchant. Rob, great analysis. When I left AMCA4 in 2011, C-17 availability rate was 86%. So we were able to provide 190 of the 222 jets. It's declined to 56%, which equates to roughly 65 fewer tails available to fly the mission each day. Since the C-17 airframe has life left, have you considered what it will cost to recover that lost availability as a way to meet mission needs while we work the Hill to get funding for new lifters? With the competition for new combat aircraft dollars, a new lifter won't materialize for at least another decade. Quick thoughts.
Oh, you're right.
1 minute each.
1 minute, and I would just say that, one, I don't have the data to get at it, but I can bet that AMC has worded that issue many times. How can we select the C-17 and keep it flying? And now, when it's supposed to stay flying to what, 2055? I'll bet they're worried about that because the airplane is already showing old airplane traits, and to get it back, to restore it like an old warbird, is going to be a very expensive process. General McNabb?
Yeah, Ken, great to hear your voice, or have Dave say your voice. I would just say it from my standpoint. I think the fact that if you can put the spare parts in, the biggest issue they've had is they have not put the parts in. People kept taking risk in logistics, and not just the Air Force, everywhere. And so the readiness of everybody, it was like, hey, we're peacetime. When the war comes up, we'll be able to build, the great nation that, what we'll do is we'll mobilize everything. It'll be like World War II. Well, we will not have that time in any way, where there's no way. In that very beginning, this thing could be over in a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 days. It could be any of those. And we got to be ready from the very beginning. And your mobility, and I would say overall, your mobility is absolutely maxed immediately on versus that you're using every bit of it right away. And that's not true of everybody, but that's true of us. And we've got to be ready to do that. And those are the things that really bothers me, is you at least get the spares right and do that. And then really look at how private industry can really help you, because right now technology has taken us to a different place. And what works for commercial like Amazon would be the same thing that would work for us, doing that last bit of delivery. And we can take advantage of what commercial's doing, and perhaps we help with the funding of some of those new technologies to make those breakthroughs.
Well, that's a
And
great way
pauses and
to
don't-
wrap up. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this rollout, and Rob, my thanks to you for this fantastic research effort, which, by the way, is now available on our website at mitchellaerospacepower.org. So go check it out. And Joe McNabb, great to see you, and thanks for being here today and sharing your insights with us. So now to our audience, from all of us here at Mitchell Institute, have a great aerospace power kind of day.
Great. Thank you all. Really enjoyed it. And well
Thank
done,
you.
Rob. Well done.